It's the Wonkhe Show. We talk elitism, Leo data, free speech and research. It's all coming up.
No one loves a nice app more than I do, but in terms of helping you make life choices, there is no substitute for professional, intelligent, tailored careers advice, which of course doesn't exist on the whole in our pre-18 education system anymore. And frankly, a gamified choice route through to a graduate career.
Welcome to the Wonkhe Show, your direct way into higher education policy, people and politics. Rachel is away this week drinking wine, so you've got me, Jim Dickinson, live from the Festival of Higher Education here in sunny Buckingham. But much more importantly, here to pick the pineapple off the pizza of policy as usual, we have three fantabulous guests in the East Midlands. We have the University of Nottingham's Registrar, Paul Greatrix. Paul, your highlight of the week, please.
My highlight of the week was slightly sad for me, which was my last ever meeting as a member of the board of HESA, and it's been great to be a part of HESA. Terrific agency, love it to bits. Huge number of challenges through being the new designated data body and with graduate outcomes, but it's a fantastic team, great staff, and I've really enjoyed being a member of the board. So a bit of a highlight tinged with sadness.
Excellent. And in London, we have Associate Director Governance Advance HE and Director of Policy at IDP to Connect, Aaron Porter. Aaron, your highlight of the week, please.
My highlight comes from across the pond, and it's a nice contrast from the Conservative Party leadership contest. The Democratic Party even have kicked off with their first big debate. They have 20 candidates in the field, and actually higher education and the cost of tuition is one of the big ticket items out there, and it's an interesting contrast with the two candidates vying to be our next Prime Minister. One of them, at least, Boris Johnson, can't seem to really give us proper scrutiny, whereas the Democratic Party, they really have a wide open field and lots of coverage and lots of scrutiny of what's going on out there.
And live from a set of DJ decks somewhere in Shoreditch, we have Wonkhe's own Arthi Nachiappan. Arthi, your highlight of the week, please.
Yeah, even at 9:30 a.m. My highlight of the week has been, basically, I'm speaking to a group of students, doing interviews for an article that I'm hopefully going to have up next week or the week after. And it's just been really, really interesting to hear about their experiences in higher education and how they're different, and then trying to, for the article, kind of draw a link to what this could mean for policy. So I'm having a great time speaking to students about this. So hopefully you'll see that article soon.
Fabulous. So yes, we start this week with the news that 16% of vice-chancellors at UK universities were privately educated, compared with 7% of the general population. That's according to the Elitist Britain 2019 report that was published this week by the Sutton Trust and the Social Mobility Commission. Paul, take us through this one.
It's a really interesting report. It comes out every year, and I think what it shows is that, as you would expect, those at the very top of the tree have very similar backgrounds in terms of their independent schooling and their Oxbridge education. But I think it's quite surprising to me, actually, the diversity or relative diversity of the vice-chancellor makeup compared with senior civil servants and top journalists and members of the cabinet. Because only, and you may say this is quite a lot, but 16% attended an independent school, 16% of our vice-chancellors, and that's down 4% since 2014. A third of them attended a grammar school, and the remainder attended a comprehensive school, which is up 13% since 2014. So it is quite interesting, because one always imagines, I think, that, and the way that vice-chancellors are represented in the press, that they are very, very much part of this kind of elite who everyone is kicking against at the moment. So it is perhaps surprising. Having said that, it is still obviously very, very different from the population as a whole, a much smaller percentage of whom are privately educated, and certainly very different from professional footballers, where very few are privately educated. But what does it say about the job of Vice-Chancellor and what's required to lead a UK university? I'm not certain it tells us a terribly large amount. Other than that, actually, you need better careers education in schools, and universities need to be better at providing careers education to their students, which we kind of knew anyway.
Aaron, the one I thought was interesting was that in this little report, pop stars are much more elitist than vice chancellors.
Yes, well, I thought that was interesting. My biggest takeaway was between different sports. Followers of my Twitter will get annoyed by my comments about kind of cricket and football, but over 40% of England's cricket team, men's cricket team, went to private schools, whereas just 5% of international football players who played for the England national team. So it's really interesting. Some of this kind of is really surprising. But when you look at the civil service permanent secretaries up at 60%, members of the House of Lords at 60%, there's a long way to go in some areas of that lead our society.
Arthi, I mean, one of the things that also struck me was it's always dangerous to take universities as kind of one lump. And as such, it's probably dangerous to take vice-chancellors as one lump. And we don't know the kind of social makeup of the vice-chancellors that are normally in the press, the Russell Group ones.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of the issue, because you just take a really small sample that you see and then you kind of extrapolate from that basis. And that's why you come to kind of decisions like, oh, that's not what I expected. I thought it'd be more, because I completely agree with Paul that when I first saw this, I was thinking, I really expect it to be a lot higher in the kind of they'd put them in the group of public servants, and I thought it would be a lot higher, basically. Yeah, but I did find that something that might, to some extent, explain it, but would need a bit more research to figure out if it's the case, is that there has been quite a lot of change. So there's been, what was it, about 11 or 13% change in the number of vice-chancellors over the last 4 years that have been from a comprehensive or a grammar school, and like Paul mentioned, 4% in the number that came from private school. So I kind of wonder as well to what extent it's to do with the changing makeup of vice-chancellors compared to perhaps more static professions over recent years, because there has been a lot of news about vice-chancellors, a lot of exits on that basis. And I wonder whether people that are coming into the role are perhaps a bit more diverse, or if that's not the case and it's just kind of a coincidence, because again, it might be the issue of what we've seen in the media that we're extrapolating from. But I think it's definitely worth looking into the changing makeup of vice-chancellors to perhaps explain some of that.
Yeah, and Paul, I guess, one of the things that this doesn't pull out is that kind of career context where, in some cases we have career structures that are still very much kind of jobs for life and people very slowly climb, whereas there's probably a bit more churn around HE.
I think that's absolutely right, Jim. I mean, and we've seen an increasing trend in vice-chancellors coming in from outside the sector as well, and indeed from overseas, because I think around 17% of the vice-chancellors were educated in other countries. So I think there's a lot more churn in there. I think the really significant thing in this as well, though, is about the kind of career track that gets you to be a vice-chancellor. It is still very much an academic route, but in order to pursue that academic route, you have to go on the PhD track, and then a series of potentially highly precarious postdoc positions before you end up as a lecturer, and then through to professor, and then eventually vice chancellor. But getting on that career track is far from straightforward for students, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds, and that's where I think that careers services and universities have a really big role to play in ensuring that whatever student's background, that they have the opportunity to see all the career tracks in front of them, and that actually an academic career, who knows, ultimately ending up as a vice-chancellor, might be something that they could do as well. And, that again comes down to career services seeing the issues around disadvantage as part of their job too. So it's not just about admissions, it's about careers advice in universities too.
Yeah. And Aaron, look, obviously, apart from, kind of drawing a direct link between the PPE course at Oxford and, being a politician, lots of the kind of professions that are in the data, there aren't automatic links, I guess, to subjects. But one that really stands out is the 65% of senior judges were schooled in independent schools, and then 71% are from Oxbridge. And there's something going on there, isn't there, about the kind of diversity of subject choices within institutions as well as kind of institutional performance?
Yes, the concentration, as you say, of the subject studied, the type of school and the type of university that our senior judges have gone to is possibly the most alarming, or at least the most striking statistic in the entire report. Indeed, because our senior judiciary need to have, in many respects, quite a deep and sophisticated understanding of society at large. I mean, frankly, compare that to the schooling and the background of those that they might encounter in the judicial system. It will really be a very striking difference indeed. I think Arthi Arthi's point also about how some professions are able to change and refresh and churn more obviously. Our judges are often long-standing. Our members of the House of Lords are not going to change very quickly. There is a real opportunity over the next 5 to 10 years for those that have the responsibility for the recruitment of our vice-chancellors, and often that sits obviously with the board of governors. They need to be really mindful of the sorts of individuals that they're looking for and really task themselves to look at a diverse pool of people that they're looking at when they're making their next appointment.
And look, just before we move off this, Paul, here's a puzzle, right? So there's obviously a huge kind of access and participation and diversity agenda on universities that is accompanied by some fairly kind of detailed regulation. But one of the things that strikes me about lots of these professions is that there are also deep umbilical links into the kind of public sector and at the very least public-private partnerships. And is it that we can't see the huge pressure on those bits of the kind of problem that, that are being exerted by others to kind of diversify? Or is it that, all the pressure is on universities and there's very little pressure on, for example, the legal profession?
That's an excellent question. I mean, I think the pressure comes in a different form, and I think in the legal area, I think lots of legal firms are doing their utmost to diversify their intake. But when you've got that, decades, indeed centuries of entrenched practice and in many cases privilege, overcoming that, I think, is a much, much bigger issue for them than it is necessarily for universities. So they feel an internal pressure to change things, but it's not a regulatory pressure. I think the really hard thing is trying to link all this up, as you say, and try and address these things consistently from top to bottom, cradle to grave, as it were. And I just think, that's incredibly hard. And until you get, a kind of government that is genuinely determined to tackle these issues, or it becomes top of the public agenda, I think it's really difficult to see it being a genuinely joined up approach. So universities have to do what they're doing and continue to do it and continue to work hard at it. But as you say, it's only part of a very big and challenging picture. There was one point I mentioned that I thought was really intriguing. One vice-chancellor doesn't have an undergraduate degree. And whilst I think isn't necessarily at all problematic, I'm just genuinely surprised. And I think it's really instructive, and all credit to whoever it is for getting where they are. I think it's a really, really interesting development.
So there you go, out yourself, whoever you are, and we'll send you a Wonkhe mug. Now, let's see who's been blogging for us this week.
Claire Marchant, CEO at UCAS, and this week in Wonkhe, I explore why HE progression and the progression of men and women through to HE needs to be looked at more in the round, and perhaps looked at in terms of the whole education system. So looking back at Key Stage 2, an 8% difference in terms of boy and girl, male and female attainment. Looking forward past HE into postgraduate, how actually there's massive salary differentials between men and women. So we know 5 years post-graduation, that can be up to a third in areas like computer science. Finally, I look into what influences those choices. Why are choices in different subjects being made? Because very often that can drive those salary attainment levels post-graduation. And we know from UCAS's survey work that actually women are much more oriented to make choices around the level of work experience, the depth of work experience they might get at a university or college. Finally, I touch on the Student Hub that gets launched by UCAS in the autumn, and that being one of the tools that students can use to really start exploring perhaps options that previously they wouldn't have considered, and opening up careers they previously would not have got into.
Now, next up, her name is Leo, and she shows what you might earn. Yes, the Department for Education has published longitudinal educational outcomes, or LEO data, employment and earnings data for providers across 2016 to 2017, broken down by subject and gender. Arthi, what is the story in here?
So there's a similar story to what we've had in previous iterations of this, which is that people earn quite noticeably different amounts depending on the profession they're in on the basis of what they studied. However, the interesting thing to come out of this set of LEO data is that graduates who studied the same course at different universities have ended up with quite a range in their earnings. So institutions offering medicine and dentistry had median earnings of 5 years after graduation. Can I say that again, please? I kept saying So institutions offering medicine and dentistry, their graduates had median earnings 5 years after graduation of between 42,700 and 52,300 per annum, while median earnings for institutions offering economics, for example, had even bigger variation from about 22,000 to about 65,000. So the Secretary of State has taken this to contribute to the arguments about why we need to secure value for money in higher education, basically saying that it's an issue if students are paying the same fees for a certain course and ending up with vastly different salaries depending on where they studied it. What I think is really interesting is that these disparities are so obvious so soon after, because 5 years is really not that long into a career to be seeing these kind of differences. But I also don't know if it was that well judged for DFE to wade into this as part of the value for money debate, because to kind of start to say that, to start to even imply that the institution that you go to can have these kind of effects, and that's something that we should then have an opinion on and therefore perhaps regulate with policy, just seems at odds with their kind of discourse around autonomy. So I'm not sure if that was the best angle to take on it, but I do think that it's going to be a topic of discussion on graduate earnings and sort of how different providers are valued in the marketplace, I suppose, if that's what you can take from it.
Paul, I guess we're back to the first point here, but I mean, it's strange this, isn't it? Because on the one hand, at least in theory, the message from government is if your graduates aren't earning the kind of top numbers, you need to cause them to. But then on the other hand, there's something going on here which kind of suggests that the solution is everyone packs into one of 6 universities near the top, and that's obviously not possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's the danger of using a single indicator as a proxy for, well, everything to do with higher education. And the idea that somehow it is just the salary of a subset of graduates 5 years after graduation that somehow defines in toto the quality of the student experience, the quality of the education provided, and the quality of their contribution to the economy is just palpable nonsense. And so I think it's really, really dangerous to view this data in isolation. Yes, it is interesting. Yes, the variations between subjects are interesting. The scale of the variances between the highest and the lowest earners are interesting, but they're part of a really, really complex higher education landscape, which I have to say, I think the Secretary of State is very unwise to focus on this as a stick with which to beat the sector. And it just doesn't really help. It's one indicator in a very complex landscape. So, I think, people who are, studying health and social care at Blackburn College, who are right down there at the bottom of the list, really shouldn't be thinking that actually, this is something that matters in the scheme of things. At the end of the day, yes, everyone wants to progress in their career. Everyone wants to get a good salary. But where you are now, the salary you're earning now after 5 years, it doesn't necessarily mean you had a bad education, or you're not contributing, or you're not happy.
Aaron, set aside the issues from a kind of individual student perspective for a second. I guess some of the framing in Augur that this talks to would effectively say, look, if there's a big taxpayer subsidy going in and there are some graduates that are earning, very little and are on what, some people would describe as worthless degrees, that there are arguably other things that we should have spent that money on.
Let's be honest, this preoccupation with Leo data is not a question of value for money for the student so much. The primary driver here is value for money for the government. That's why so much research has been commissioned, and that's why we continue to get this emphasis on analysing the earnings data of graduates now 5 years post their graduation. There is a serious point about understanding the value for money for the individual as well. And of course, there will be graduates on certain disciplines who don't get close to crossing the 23,000 as proposed threshold for repayment. And there does need to be an understanding of what the cost to that individual will be. But let's be under no illusion. The preoccupation with this interest in Leo data is because the government wants to understand its own value for money. I don't really think it's about the value for money for the students that pass through our higher education system.
Arthi, we of course recall Sam Gyimah roaming around the country calling up Britain. And of course, there's a whole kind of seam of work in this, isn't there, which says if you give students data, they can make choices. But I guess one of the things that has started to emerge in, to some extent in Augur and now, is that a kind of sense that the government is frustrated that it keeps telling students that they're not going to earn much, but they still keep enrolling on programmes.
Yeah, I think partly goes to show that the cultural kind of understandings are much more important than the actual data, because I don't remember as a prospective student looking up data before entering university, even knowing what I was supposed to be looking at, what the government was suggesting we look at to make choices, I probably went more on kind of general perceptions based on culture surrounding universities and what my parents thought and what my school and certain teachers had told me. And those are all much more valuable. And I think that they still are much more valuable to a lot of students. So it's much more worth kind of understanding how students are actually making their decisions and probably improving the kind of information they have off the basis of what they're already using, rather than kind of thinking you can change how students make their decisions and then being confused when they don't.
And Paul, obviously, the Treasury wants some of the money back, and the amount that is loaned out to students that comes back is important. But if I look at all of the other indicators around kind of careers and what happens to people in their 20s and so on, I'm starting to think that measuring anything 5 years out is daft.
Absolutely, it's just very, very narrow, and it's too soon as well. And also it's just a single dimensional reflection of people's contribution to society. It is not just about the earnings. It's not just about the tax they pay, but it's about their contribution to society as a whole. 5 years is a heck of a short time. Lots of people are still trying to find their feet and establish what their career choices are going to be. If you're in the profession, you know where you're going. If you're a medic or a dentist or a lawyer, you may well know where you're going. But for lots and lots of graduates, actually, they're still finding their feet and trying to decide what career path they want to follow. And it may be a multifaceted path anyway, but I mean, it's just, Treasury, government will go for whatever indicators they can get, and they'll latch upon them with enthusiasm and zeal and draw conclusions from them. Can I say one other thing about the information for students? Because part of the narrative, as you rightly point out, Jim, is the idea that if you provide more and better information for potential students, then they will be able to make better informed decisions, and that somehow this will help promote competition within the sector. As we will recall, last year, the Department for Education launched an exciting competition to develop 2 new apps to help students make better choices on what and where to study. And these are now out and available to play with. At least one of them's in beta. The other one may be fully developed. I've had a go, and I have to say I don't think they're going to really transform the landscape. No one loves a nice app more than I do, but in terms of helping you make life choices, there is no substitute for professional, intelligent, tailored careers advice, which of course doesn't exist on the whole in our pre-18 education system anymore. And frankly, a gamified choice routes through to a graduate career, and do you prefer a campus or a city-based university questionnaire type thing, I think has some way to go to fill in that gap.
On the day they came out, I was playing with one of them, and I thought it was roughly as useful as Spotify's Discover Weekly algorithm. And the thing about that is, it's one thing for me to get annoyed on the train into work at Wonkhe because Spotify thinks I don't know about ABBA's Waterloo. It's quite another to be making, huge life choices off the back of, this kind of, nonsense. Anyone else got anything?
Yeah, just something quick. I was just thinking when, Paul, you were saying about how short 5 years is as a timeline for this kind of thing. It just kind of, it also seems a little bit outdated in the sense that it doesn't seem to really kind of acknowledge the fact that, especially as you mentioned with people that haven't done kind of professional degrees that would lead them directly into one occupation, is the kind of value of horizontal career changes or career switch ups completely, which are just much more of a facet of kind of finding your feet in your career now. And they have a lot of value, and they mean that when you do get into a certain career, you can probably, that experience that you've had doesn't go to waste. You might, earn a lot more, a lot quicker. Not that that's the only relevant measure, but it just doesn't seem to have enough nuance to understand exactly where different people are in their careers.
That's actually very interesting, Arthi, because of course there was Resolution Foundation data the other week that said that one of the things that's happening is that graduates are moving jobs less than we think because there are because the benefit of shifting to another city, given the cost of rent, is kind of dissipating, and that speaks to the kind of David Willett's point, doesn't it, Aaron, that, when you look at Leo data, one of the things you're looking at is economic performance. You're not necessarily looking at student performance or even university performance.
Yes, I mean, that's one of David Willett's is big arguments. And actually, one of the Leo data could be seen as quite positive news, given that, we're only a decade after the big recession, 2009. Actually, earnings data is holding up reasonably well. But you're right, it's so much more complicated than simply, how good your higher education was and what you go on to do. There's the geographic conditions, there's regional variation. But more importantly, this assumes that most people are motivated by money. Lots of graduates are looking at, what's interesting to them, and that they will pursue a career that's personally fulfilling rather than financially rewarding.
Can I just say one more thing about these exciting apps? Is that, like you, I got frustrated. I tried to reverse engineer a career in higher education administration. And failed dismally, and ended up as a shop assistant, which I thought was quite special. Well, as you know, I've been collecting true crime on campus reports from our wonderful campus security team here at the University of Nottingham over many, many years now. And universities remain exciting and challenging places to work. Many students and staff and visitors have no idea what goes on in the dark underbelly of campus life, but our security team find out everything, and we have an ever-increasing set of case notes in the True Crime on Campus files, brought to you here live on Wonkhe.
2325. Report that a picture had been taken off the wall in the hall by a pirate. The pirate had gone in the direction of the mooch bar. Security attended the mooch bar, where they found over 40 pirates, none of whom had the picture. 2025. Report of a group of 50 students stealing microwaves, ironing boards and toasters from the hall. Security attended. The group were located on the Downs, and a number of the group was stopped and details were taken. A number of this group were dressed in their underwear or naked. The Compliance and Operations Manager was informed. 0005. Report that a guest in Cripps Annex couldn't find his room. The guest had been drinking. Officers attended. The guest stated he was in room 9. The officers looked at his key, which stated he was in room 6. He had the key fob upside down.
And don't forget, the book True Crime on Campus is available from all good and a number of bad bookshops. Now, let's see who else has been blogging for us this week.
Hi, this is James Wilston at the University of Sheffield. I'm ringing to talk about the piece that Netta Weinstein and I wrote this week for Wonkhe, based on the initial findings of a project called the Real-Time Ref Review. This is an evaluation of the current 2021 Research Excellence Framework and an attempt to see whether the reforms that were introduced to the REF following the Stern Review in 2016 have actually changed any aspects of the exercise and the way it's experienced by researchers at the front line. So the article sort of sets this in the context of the current debate over QR funding, which is obviously hotting up once again, and talks about the rationale for the Real-Time Ref Review project, basically that often in debates about the REF, those who shout loudest tend to dominate the terms of discussion. We felt it would be valuable to get a more distributed picture of how the REF's playing out, hence the real-time review, and to do so while the REF is ongoing rather than waiting until the whole exercise finishes. So the article sums up some of the views that emerge from that. Basically, people don't like the REF, we knew that already, but their views aren't as perhaps as viscerally hostile as one might sometimes take to be the case from media coverage of the REF. And we talk particularly about the positive aspects of the new REF, the new rules that people have seemed to warm towards, particularly its approach to open access, open research, and its more flexible approach to outputs relative to individuals. So some positives amidst the broader picture, and I hope that an exercise like this can be used by Research England to inform the next REF, whenever that may be imposed upon us.
Now, next up, we're going to talk about free speech. But before we get into that, it's advert time, and I want to tell you about Wonkhe Students' Unions. Representing students and contributing to policy effectively has never been easy, but these days it's really tough. HE policy can be complex, confusing, and constantly changing. We sometimes take for granted just how impenetrable the sector's language and structures are for anyone, let alone student officers that have just been elected and won't have the luxury of a year to bed in. We know that student officers and staff that understand the environment and the issues are more effective, they get more done, and they make a bigger contribution to the life of our sector. And given Wonkhe is all about finding and promoting diverse voices, we've launched Wonkhe Students' Unions. We produce weekly policy briefings and beginner's guides on key issues in HE, a bespoke weekly news service for SUs featuring the latest developments, news coverage, analysis, and opportunities for unions, as well as access to a dedicated discussion group and news alerts. And subscribers can take advantage of training, take part in dedicated webinars on key issues that unions will be discussing with institutions, as well as being able to access the team here at Wonkhe with questions and queries. So, if your institution is serious about student representation and engagement, your students' union really should be signed up. To find out more, go to wonkhe.com/SUs. Now, next up, the UK's Prevent strategy is the single biggest threat to free speech on campus. That's one of the assertions in a new paper published this week by the Higher Education Policy Institute. It says that Prevent is a much bigger threat than media caricatures of snowflake students, according to a director of Liberty. Aaron, give us an overview of this one.
Well, it's yet another contribution to the ongoing debate, as it were, about free speech and censorship on campus. The report recognises the concerns of those who wish to restrict free speech as a way of protecting others, but concludes that restrictions on free speech usually end up being counterproductive. It does, as you say, actually points the finger much more towards the government's own Prevent strategy than is able to find, or at least evidence, any real issues of restrictions of free speech on campus. Given there's a large volume of literature now on the extent to which there is or there isn't a real issue of free speech on our campuses, this is, I would say, on the more thoughtful end of the spectrum. But I would say perhaps it doesn't offer us any sort of tantalising new angle. And perhaps it's most important to remind ourselves that it quotes the House of Lords Select Committee inquiry, which says that there doesn't really appear to be any major issue. So it really begs for me the question, why are we still talking about whether there's an issue of free speech on campus or not?
Paul, is there an issue with free speech on campus or not?
I mean, I will say a little more on that, but I think it's always dangerous to look over to the US for guidance on this, because the legal context is very, very different there. The legal framework in the UK, the critical one for us is the 1986 Act, which of course was brought in to stop universities and student unions in particular from preventing Conservative ministers speaking on campus. And I'm afraid I'm old enough to remember the introduction of that act and the controversy it caused at the time. But actually, in practice, over the years, it has surprisingly served us reasonably well, and hasn't prevented things in a way that all the kind of stuff and the commentary from previous ministers has suggested that there has been a huge problem. There really, really hasn't. Having said that, Prevent is a new dimension. Human Rights Act is a new dimension. But I do think that the 1986 Act does still hold good, and that gives us a good framework for ensuring that we enable free speech on the whole to be supported and protected. Prevent, it's often suggested, has a chilling effect. The chilling effect only works if you let it. And I think it's really, really important for universities to remain confident and robust in enabling people to speak in what is the most open and conducive example of free speech in our country.
Arthi, it strikes me that one of the things that the paper does, which is what so much of this debate does, is conflate what I might call the way we treat each other on campus with the discussion of complex ideas. And it seems to me that we aren't free to, tear chunks out of each other or be racist to each other, but of course we're free to discuss academic concepts.
There isn't that much of a line, I suppose, because even because if you're talking about speaker events, for example, you'll be talking about ideologies and kind of the difference between academic concepts and kind of just treating people with respect is not actually that clear, in the sense that if you're talking about certain ideologies, that might have implications for what you think about certain people's existence, basically, or what you think of certain people's place in society. And that's kind of not a direct direct or targeted at any individual person, but it's still, by talking about those concepts, you're still potentially invalidating someone's kind of something quite fundamental about them. So I think that the issue comes from the fact that it is difficult to separate those two things. Although I do think that the areas where they overlap are very, very small in comparison to all of the things that are discussed at university, all of the areas of kind of academic interest. So it's important to recognize that these kind of overlaps are really genuinely very small. And so I do think it is, like you said, it is an issue to conflate them, but I disagree in the sense that I think the areas where they are overlapping is where the battleground is.
And Aaron, Artie's got a point, hasn't she? So, universities and what they teach and how they teach it aren't free from kind of social norms and social concepts and trends and so on, and aren't those that are kind of campaigning and calling for certain speakers to be restricted or banned, aren't they just kind of themselves expressing their free speech and influencing the way in which society's views develop?
Yes, and the report to a large degree points out, of course, that those who are from sort of persecuted groups and minority groups are often those that are at the front line of campaigning against certain individuals, and that's to be expected because they're the ones who will feel this most prominently. As ever with these things, there's a really fine line to tread here. When someone is invited with controversial views, within the parameters of the law, they largely should be allowed to speak. But equally, those that don't want to listen to them or want to voice their opposition to them are perfectly and equally entitled to that perspective as well. As I say, I think the biggest problem with this whole issue has often been the reporting, or I might say the misreporting of what has gone on a lot of our campuses, where students have chosen to ignore someone or protest against someone, and that's led to an invitation being withdrawn. That is sometimes then portrayed as free speech not being granted, when it's a lot more complicated than that, and there's a responsibility on those that report around free speech to really understand what it is that they're talking about.
All right. All I was just going to say is that I think that whilst the situation is, as Aaron describes, nowhere near as bad as is often portrayed by the extreme. I was going to say the extreme wings of government and Spiked, but both government and Spiked. There are really no grounds for complacency. And it's one of those things that actually requires eternal vigilance on campus to ensure that, actually free speech is protected, and that students feel safe and secure. And it's just one of those things you've got to keep on top of all the time.
Yes, but I agree with Paul, but equally, I struggle to think of any other institutions in UK society where there is as much free speech as there is in our universities. Yeah. So again, that's part of the mix too.
Yeah, and this is the point that friend of the show Charles Heyman always makes, isn't it? Which is, if you look at Auga and the 50% that don't go to university, who's out protecting kind of spaces where people can have free and open debate there? There's an awful lot of scrutiny on higher education and little elsewhere. Now, good. It's time for Yes, but does it correlate, folks? Here to set this week's correlation question is Wonkhe's associate editor, David Kernahan's son, Ben.
Hello, it's Ben again. My dad's just back, but I think he's asleep, so here's one more correlation question from me. Some academics get paid a lot of money, and I think that might be in places that have a lot of money saved up. So I've compared the percentage of academic staff that earn more than £60,000 with institutional reserves at 31st of July 2018. Do you need lots of savings to pay big salaries? Does it correlate?
No, it doesn't correlate. Why? Why? Because I don't think it does. Well, because I think reserves are a misleading indicator of institutional performance or indeed ability to pay large salaries.
I'd say that there's probably a moderate correlation between the universities with the biggest reserves. They will be at the older end of the spectrum. They will probably have a subject mix that includes medicine, that typically has a lot more of the more highly paid staff. So I think there might be just about enough evidence to be able to draw some kind of line through the chart that makes sense.
Ooh. I don't think it correlates. I don't think it correlates, and for no reason.
Brilliant.
The answer is no. R squared is 0.13, so there's very little relationship between the two. It's overwhelmingly the Russell group with the big balances. Just look at Edinburgh, Oxford and Cambridge. But all kinds of places pay big salaries. I think you need to for professors and senior leaders. It's an interesting graph, so do have a look at the show page.
And finally, Research England has published research reporting on a pilot study which explores the views of academic staff and research managers in 4 institutions on the REF. Arthi, what does it say?
So I think this is a really interesting one because it actually spoke to academics. It's got just under 600 academics participating, and it's found that the responses to REF are moderately unpopular, so they're moderately negative responses. However, there are certain good things. So where REF meets with approval among academics is its impact on open research practice and open access publication. However, there's something that academics struggled with, or said they struggled with in the survey, is that they felt somewhat pressured to drive performance in REF for their institutions. And more worryingly, in my opinion, is that they felt it had some kind of effect on their autonomy to pick and tailor completely their own research interests. So they felt, in other words, to some extent, they had to alter their focus based on performing better in these metrics. So I think that's probably a worrying outcome. It seems depressingly similar in the sense that when metrics are introduced, there's always a kind of worry as to how you can perform better in these metrics. But I think it's also it's a responsibility when choosing these metrics to kind of forecast what these effects might be and try and avert them, or at least have certain areas that you safeguard from these kind of impacts. And it's a shame that some academics, at least the ones surveyed, feel that they've had to in any way change their research focus in order to perform better in these metrics.
Paul, there's a fine line here, isn't there? Because on the one hand, you want, academic freedom, academics to be able to kind of follow their nose and discover things. But on the other hand, the taxpayer needs bang for buck.
Yeah, and I think that when research assessment started back in whenever it was, a long time ago, I think 1992, something like that. I mean, the aim was to very much focus on more valuable or targeted investment in research to deliver wider economic benefit. But I think the reality is there's still, a huge amount of freedom within universities for individuals and teams and institutions themselves to focus on areas that they want to focus on, which they think are, gaps in terms of public knowledge or are fertile grounds for future research. So there are lots of opportunities still, but there is a research framework there. There you have to, in order to access larger amounts of public money, to go through a formal assessment process and ensure that you are delivering the outputs which are expected for the money. So it is more of a balanced picture. I'm genuinely surprised by the relatively balanced views of this panel of 600 researchers, I have to say, because a lot of the narrative is very, very negative. And yes, there are many challenges. Yes, there are some negative feelings here, but it's not nearly as cataclysmic as I have to say I would have expected it, given all of the public discourse.
Aaron, I guess one of the things that strikes me about this is that quite often, government or an arm of government will introduce some kind of measure. And then in order to kind of perform well in the measure, there is some good behaviour on it on the part of institutions and some bad behaviour. And I can never really call whether the problem is the measure and we should have predicted the bad behaviour, or whether it's the bad behaviour itself.
Yeah, I think that's the most interesting angle to think about this, because as you say, on the one hand, we've got kind of government and we've got research. We've got the research rules being set at a national level, but it's how institutions choose to interpret it. And I think it's the extent to which some institutions have really perhaps driven quite a stringent, tight internal culture and framework, which perhaps has in some respects led to higher degrees of dissatisfaction, whereas in some institutions, I guess there's a freer, more open approach. On the one hand, it will be interesting then to see whether the institutions that perhaps have a more defined approach has actually led to improved research income and better ratings in the exercise compared to those that have perhaps taken a more open approach. But I think it's more interesting to think about how individual institutions have chosen to interpret the rules by which everyone is playing to.
Universities exist in part to conduct research which will benefit society and humanity, right? And this exercise is about assessing essentially the value of investment made by government in that enterprise. But there remains, real latitude for institutions to continue to do the right thing here, and simply chasing results through this kind of exercise is counterproductive in the long run, and I think most universities now recognise that. The rules now recognise that, and actually, it's much more about rewarding genuine quality where it exists. And I think that's a move in the right direction, and to be supported, and probably shows why a higher proportion are more positively disposed towards the new framework than in the past.
So that's about it for this week. Remember to delve deeper into anything we've discussed today. You'll find links in the show notes. Don't forget you can subscribe to the podcast automatically. Just search for The Wonkhe Show via iTunes or your favourite Android podcast directory, or you'll find the feed you need on wonkhe.com/podcast. And if you fancy appearing as a guest on The Wonkhe Show, do drop us an email on team@wonkhe.com and we'll be in touch. So huge thanks to Paul, Aaron and Arthi, everyone at Team Wonkhe for making it happen. And until next week, speak freely.